Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. As everyone gets joined in, it looks like a couple more folks are joining now. I want to just make a couple of announcements. First, we will be recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress. So you can always come back and see the content. If you'd like to ask our speakers any questions during this session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen in the Whova window. This will allow our moderator, Matthew, to be able to see all the questions coming in. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with any cameras or microphones. And with that, it looks like we're ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our moderator so that we can begin. Matthew Thompson will be joining us to kick things off.
Hey, thanks, Sam, and welcome everyone to the first of 2 sessions, Bayesian modeling and causal inference in wildfire risk assessment. I'd like to start it off by acknowledging and expressing gratitude towards John Carragher and Mace Barron, who helped recruit participants and helped with the design of this special session, and who are also respectively lead author and co-author on the first 2 of these presentations. And so without further ado, I'll pass it off to Mace Barron. He is a toxicologist with the Office of Research and Development with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and he'll be talking about assessment of wildfire risk with Bayesian networks. Mace, take it away. Thank you.
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to load up my PowerPoint here. Just take you a second. All right. Hopefully y'all can see the first slide, and I just wanted to thank everybody. This is my very first fire conference, so really excited to be part of it, and wish we were all in Destin. So this presentation is more of an introduction to causal assessment, and with the focus on Bayesian networks. And myself, Matt, and John are the authors of it. So what's the need for causal networks? Well, we all know wildfire risks and losses are increased over the last 100 years through population expansion, land use, management practices, global climate change. And what I'm learning, I'm new to the fire field, but there's extensive efforts at modeling the probability and severity of wildfires, but fewer efforts at examining causal linkages between wildfires and impacts on ecological receptors and critical habitats. And here's our friend down here smoking a bear. So how do we model these causal linkages on wildfire frequency and severity? You know, it's complex, as y'all know. We have changes to the renewal and succession patterns in the forest systems, you know, direct impacts to wildlife and vegetation, species, and composition, changes to soil composition and physical structure, and runoff to aquatic systems. So one approach for doing this that's been used from advertising to medicine is the use of Bayesian networks, and I'm sure a lot of people at the conference are more expert than myself in this. But just to provide you some introduction, which will also lead into the later talks in our session today, is BNs, or Bayesian networks. These are probabilistic tools for graphing and evaluating causal knowledge and uncertainties in complex systems. They are graphical models. Here's a little example at the bottom here. And with the variables are nodes or little dots here in a directed acyclic graph. So what we're doing in a typical Bayesian network is predicting likelihood of an event, such as event C here, based on 2 particular potential causes, A and B. So there's generally been limited application to the quantitative assessment of ecological risks and impacts of wildfires. BNs have been used in pesticide risk assessments and other aspects. So just to give you a kind of the ABCs, this is kind of an example from Wikipedia on what's called total probability. So here we have a factory, we have factory X that about 60% of the bulbs, light bulbs in the market are from factory X, and about 40% of the bulbs in the market are from factory Y. Well, the thing is that in factory X, 99% of their bulbs work for over 5,000 hours. That means only 1% don't meet this 5,000 hour lifespan for a light bulb, while factory Y has a lower success rate in producing these longer light bulbs. So then what a Bayesian network does is it'll just take these probabilities of X and Y, and then it will compute through through this conditional probability table, and then it'll compute what the estimated, if you were just to go to the store, 97% of your light bulbs would work for over 5,000. That's just kind of the basic engines. One of the really great things about Bayesian networks and how they're frequently used is in inference. And there's two types of inference that Bayesian networks are used for. The first on your left is known as predictive inference. And again, this is our factory X, which is produces our longer life light bulbs in our factory Y. So in this case, if we're only producing, the store you go to only has factory Y light bulbs, you end up with a 95% chance or a 5% chance that your light bulb won't be a long-lasting one. And then diagnostic inference is just sort of, so this is prediction of future events and based on past observations. And that's what's sort of typically used for. This other aspect is called diagnostic inference, and that's the likelihood of a state, such as receiving 100% of all the bulbs you bought work less than 5,000. What could possibly have been the composition of those factory deliveries of those light bulbs? Okay, so just some examples in BNs in wildfire analysis. These are just some examples. These come from a paper that John, Matt, and myself published recently. And here's just some examples. I won't go through these in the interest of time, but they're in our journal article. So what are some opportunities for using Bayesian networks for assessing wildfire impacts to ecological systems? Well, we can explore these through levels of causal representation and scenario examination. And again, here's a paper we can provide you guys. But one of the sort of the real powerful tools are known as interventions. And so an intervention is here's our example Bayesian network, and then we can introduce an intervention. Maybe it's fuel treatment, maybe it's habitat enhancement, and I'll walk you through a couple brief examples for this. And so whenever there's an intervention, there's both intended and unintended consequences. Intended are, for example, the effect on C might be what we intended it to do, such as better habitat or fewer wildfires. There's also unintended consequences. Just by doing an intervention, there can be other aspects affected. So in our journal article, which is kind of this summary talks based on, is we gave two examples. One is the red cockaded woodpecker habitat restoration, and the next one is an owl example. But so kind of two aspects here, one with intervention and one without. So one thing is we could build a causally based network just for the assessment of risk. We could have fire weather, fuel loads, pine density, things like that. Ultimately, that might affect cavity tree density for the woodpecker. We can also do an intervention, in this case, such as habitat restoration. In this case, maybe we could introduce some artificial cavities. And then ultimately we can compute this in terms of utility in more of a decision analysis context. Here's just another example for spotted owls. Again, here we're ultimately trying to predict owl abundance, and because it's really based on old growth, such as old growth forests, but we can look at climate scenarios, time since fire, and then ultimately assess this causal network. And then in a decision context, we can do something, for example, fuel treatment. We can reduce fuel load, and ultimately compute utility. And in terms of numeric representation, so going back to our owl example, we have the same nodes and same causal network, and then we can introduce for example, our fuel treatment as low, medium, and high, for example, and then compute a utility factor. So ultimately, we believe that the utilities of BNs and wildfire ecology risk assessment management can include causal diagrams to provide tools for supporting assessments and decision making. Bayesian networks, they provide the calculus necessary for including uncertainties in causal relationships. So we can actually not just understand the causal linkages and interdependencies of our factors, but actually provide some quantitation of prediction. And ultimately, we think these can be useful at establishing a causal hierarchy for assessment and decision making, in that this will, I think, help us all moving forward. So with that, I'm gonna turn off my screen, and here's your Smokey the Bear. And let me see if I can get back to you guys and stop share. Bam.
Well, thanks very much, Mace. And we are doing pretty good on time. So we do have some time for Q&A until 20 after the hour. Also, just as a plug, we have the entire 100-hour block, but only 80 minutes for speakers at 20 minutes each. So there will be time for discussion at the end. And I'll be monitoring the Whova if folks do want to put anything in the chat or the Q&A. So while we wait and see if folks have any kind of overview questions or rather questions about your overview, Mace, I'll start with one. Folks don't know this about you, but I do, which is that you have a background working in disaster response in the context of oil fields. So I'm wondering kind of what, if any, parallels you have seen so far, or maybe your experiences in using Bayesian modeling, if at all, in that realm.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, Matt. Yeah, so I work for US EPA, and we're not the forest folks, but we do have a lot of responsibilities in terms of oil spill response. So we more right now, Bayesian networks we've used more in sort of a conceptual framework. So in oil spill response, and I'm assuming maybe there's some analogies in wildfire response, that it's what's typically U.S. Coast Guard calls the least regret scenario. So there's never really a best or impactless decision of how are we going to burn oil or put chemical dispersants into the environment, or try to protect the shoreline. Well, then maybe we'll expose marine resources more that way. So one sort of opportunity, John and I did this a few years ago, is used a sort of a influence diagram, sort of a network-based decision diagram, where the output was ecological services. So recreational sport, or providing food, for seafood and things like that, and then trying to look at, if you used different response options, how that might increase your utility in terms of maximizing the protection of ecological resources and services. And
we have one new question in the chat that I think is probably good enough that we'll probably revisit it again when we have the discussion. But I'll throw it out now, Mace, to see if you have some insights given your experience. What are the roles of uncertainty analysis and sensitivity analysis? Jeff specifically asked about the forest context, but maybe you've dealt with uncertainty or sensitivity analysis in your toxicology domain as well.
Yeah. So give you another example is we were looking at did a Bayesian network analysis of Florida panther risks from mercury in the 90s because of a lot of power plant emissions. There was a lot of mercury exposure to populations of an endangered, like a cougar, like a western cougar, a Florida subspecies called the Florida panther. And so in this model, for example, we used it both retrodictively and prospectively to backcast, well, when mercury levels were really high in the food web, was there sufficient levels through dietary risk to panthers that would cause, loss of litters or maybe even a direct, adult morbidity or things like that. And then, but the sensitivity part of it was, so we developed a food web model, and the sensitivity analysis was really useful at trying to figure out, well, which of these parameters had the largest influence on our estimated risks. So, John Carragher, who's a co-author, and this is real expert in doing these sensitivity analyses, but they're very useful, and through Netica or these other, basic kind of Bayesian networks available softwares, they can compute, you can develop a sensitivity analysis. So then what parameters have the greatest influence or the largest uncertainties, and then maybe that's where you put your research. I'm sure that's really analogous to, fire science.
We have another question in the chat, although I do want to put a pin on that uncertainty and sensitivity analysis because I think it's a valuable one, and I myself have some questions about it. Question in the chat from Susan Connard, excuse me, is, and this is relevant both to your talk as well as the talk that I am about to pretend to act like I know what I'm talking about. When you get inference in these Bayesian networks, is it truly causal or is it limited to correlation domain?
Right. No, that's a great question. And always defer to John for the real answer. But yeah, you can have true causal networks, or I call them like, pseudo causal, that they may be co-correlated and they appear causally linked. And I think outside of my expertise, but I think there's more sophisticated ways at trying to actually build the network so that it's a truly a causal one. And just another side note, which I should have mentioned, was a lot of the times, for parameterizing these nodes, it's based on data collection, right? So you just go back and you've can parameterize, but a lot of it is where I'm sure a lot of your the fire science folks would come in as, it's called expert elicitation. So you can actually rank, it's semi-quantitative, but it's based on, say, your expertise, and is this truly a causal linkage, and maybe it is correlated and not actually, maybe there's another factor in there that's really controlling it.
Cool. Well, we got about just a little bit less than a minute to go, so Mace, we'll say thanks very much and look forward to having you join us again for the discussion. And I'll go ahead and just segue into the next presentation. Before I do, this is the person who was brought into the chat, Judea Pearl's book, The Book of Why, which Mace and John convinced me to purchase and read. And I would be lying to the group if I said I fully understood it. But it certainly introduces a lot of the rationale underlying that you can do, according to Judea Pearl anyway, causal inference with Bayesian modeling as well as structural equation modeling. And with that, I'll go ahead and segue to the next author, which is me. And I'll open my slide. I'll let you all know that we're going to be doing a joint presentation. So John is going to take the reins for the second half of the presentation. I'm going to give an overview, a kind of simplistic overview. This is really exploratory. It's based on just a lot of conversations with John and Mace, as well as insight from that book. We're looking at evaluating the performance or the effectiveness, if you will, of fuel treatments using some of the ideas from probabilistic inference. After I go through the example, John will then take the reins and get into some of the key theoretical aspects that underpin this idea of probabilistic and causal inference. I also want to acknowledge Kevin Vogler and Joe Scott from Pyrologics, a fire consulting firm out of Missoula. They provided a lot of the modeling and data for our example. We address counterfactuals quite often in wildfire. For those who attended the fuel treatment effectiveness session that was ran by Terry Jane earlier, there was a lot of kind of interesting insights into how do we evaluate the effectiveness of treatments both within the area that was treated as well as across the landscape. And a lot of that is really asking counterfactual questions. What would the fire have done had it not burned into that area that was previously treated, either through mechanical thinning or prescribed fire or some other means? And this is some pretty salient work by Mark Cochran and others. Other questions include, what might that large fire have done had it not burned into a previous large and highly consequential fire, like we have here an example from the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico that burned into the Cerro Grande fire. And so people have typically addressed these questions with fire behavior models, with ensemble models. And we're basically borrowing from those insights and just trying to embed it within this framework. And so the motivation we're borrowing here is really this event attribution, not perhaps unique to climate science, but certainly is where we got our motivation from. And so the idea is really, can we quantify the influence of forcings, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, on the frequency or magnitude of extreme events? So this literature is certainly new to me, but I think over time you're seeing a trend of more of these types of studies looking at quantifying the influence of climate change on heat waves, droughts, extreme precipitation events. And as you see, as one example on the right, increasingly applied to issues of wildland fire as well. The intent is basically comparing the probability of an event's occurrence in the observed world with climatic forcings and in the counterfactual world where those don't exist. And so the idea here, which is certainly preliminary and exploratory, but we're kind of reframing this framework where we're applying this, say, for example, in frequent fire forests of the Western US, where in the over the past century or so, fire exclusion, we're calling that the forcing that has led to these increased fuel loads. So we're seeing an increased level of hazard and risk because of that forcing function of fire exclusion. And then the counterfactual here is some other hypothetically treated landscape. And we're going to explore several treatment scenarios. So the event attribution framework, there's really kind of four key things to keep in mind here. And of course, we'll get into some more underneath the hood. Again, we're looking at the probability of this extreme event occurring in the real world, as well as it occurring in this counterfactual world. We're looking at the fraction of attributable risk, or FAR. That's how much of the likelihood of that extreme event occurring is due to the forcing that we saw in the real world relative to the counterfactual world. And then the risk ratio is just that. It's the ratio of those two probabilities. How much more likely or less likely is this extreme event to happen in the observed world versus the counterfactual world? The way we're going to operationalize this for purposes of demonstration is looking at simulated fire sizes, recognizing that fire size certainly is not the best measure or outcome when it comes to social, ecological, economic concerns, but for our purposes here in ensemble modeling, it's sufficient to hopefully demonstrate proof of concept. Okay, we are looking at some ensemble simulation results from a landscape in northern New Mexico in the USA. We're using a fairly common fire modeling system called FSIM, developed by the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, that gives us fire size distributions and event sets. We're looking at multiple treatment scenarios this is from a different study, and we're admittedly just kind of borrowing and porting these results over. We're exploring different treatment strategies in terms of their placement, the spatial pattern, as well as the extent. And within this modeling framework, the only variable we're changing is the fuel model. So we can isolate differences in fuel conditions, and that allows us to make this kind of apples to apples comparison in this observed and counterfactual world. So some basic results, I won't get too into detail. These are just cumulative fire size distributions. Treatments generally reduce fire sizes to be expected. For a given treatment extent, if you have an optimized treatment strategy, that does better at reducing size relative to random. However, this difference attenuates as you treat more and more of the landscape. So if you can treat 5% of the landscape, you get a much bigger bang for your buck in terms of reduced fire sizes if you spatially optimize. But if you're able to treat up to 25%, that difference is much more minor. Now segueing into the kind of two key variables I introduced, fraction of attributable risk. Again, this is the likelihood of the fire size that is attributable to the forcing. Again, the forcing in this framework is fire exclusion and increased fuel loads. So the fraction of attributable risk, FAR, it increases in magnitude, increases with the magnitude of the extreme event. It approaches 1.0 for the largest treatment extent. In other words, the likelihood of seeing a fire of a given size, 70,000 acres or more, roughly 30,000 hectares, approaches 1, comparing the 25% treatment counterfactual to the observed. Another way of putting this in layman's terms is really, and this is of course consistent with a lot of other literature, it's just a new framework, fire exclusion favors more extreme fire size values compared to these counterfactual scenarios. Okay, the risk ratio. The risk ratio also increases with the magnitude of the extreme event. It approaches up to 18, a factor of 18. So that means under fire exclusion, exceeding fire sizes of 30,000 hectares or more is 18 times more likely under the observed landscape with the fire exclusion forcing relative to these counterfactually treated landscapes. So that's just, the quick and dirty of the framework. And what I am going to do now is hand it over to John, who's going to take us a little bit more under the hood and tell us some of the complexity of actually inferring causal inference here. So John, if you'll join us and take it away.
Great, thanks, Matt. Trying to start my video, but for some reason it's not starting. But I'll get started anyways. So I'm going to be talking about how to perform counterfactual inference using Bayesian networks. And as we saw in Mace's presentation, even a simple example with where a light bulb comes from and light bulb longevity and probabilities from Wikipedia can be simplified even more by using a Bayesian network. But when we have these very complex and messy problems, it almost is a requirement for performing these high-level counterfactual analyses with a Bayesian network. And this ladder over here is a modification of Pearl's causal ladder at the top, level 3, imagining. This is where we perform our counterfactual inference. Level 2, doing interventional inferences. This is where we simulate interventions, as Mace was showing, and also where we can build decision models that calculate expected utility. And level 1 is seeing, and this is where most classical statistics and machine learning, and even as we discovered when we were writing this paper, where most Bayesian networks, causal Bayesian networks lie. Most of the, for example, the scenario analysis done with Bayesian networks is at the seeing level. It's still a very powerful tool with the Bayesian network, but we're seeing less of the counterfactual inference, but we think that is changing, and we'll explore the power of it in these next slides. Next slide. So let's look at a simple common problem. We had something that occurred in the past, an effect with potential influential antecedents that also occurred, the causes. And we want to examine, well, what would have happened if one or more of these antecedents were removed? Would the effects still have occurred? And so we have information here that most of our quantitative analyses and modeling aren't really equipped to handle. We have information that something did occur and a cause occurred and effect occurred. And we want to look at, well, what happens if we remove this cause and change these things? And we can answer this by prediction, but we're not really incorporating all the information that we have available to us that these things did occur. And it kind of reminds me a bit of the Monty Hall problem, where we want to use all the information available to make proper inferences. And that's where the power of this counterfactual analysis comes in. Next slide. So Udero has provided us a 3-step solution. He describes it in his book of Why, and he goes into more details on the mathematics in his 2009 book, Causality, as well as some of his journal articles. And just as an overview, we'll get into how these are calculated with a Bayesian network soon. But the first step is abduction. This is the seeing step. We put observations on what did occur. This cause did occur and this effect did occur in the past, for example. Then the next step is action. This is where we intervene on the model to change the counterfactual by changing the cause and examining the implications for the effect. And then prediction, we predict the effect in the counterfactual world from all the information above. Next slide, please. So this is a Bayesian network flow that can be used for performing counterfactual inference. And there's 3 sets of variables we have to consider when developing a Bayesian network for counterfactual inference. One are the variables for the actual world, and then the other are the variables on the other side for the counterfactual world, which is like a mirror world of the actual world. And we signify that we're using a variable for the counterfactual world by adding the star next to the variable name. And bridging these 2 worlds are our background variables that are the probability distributions are updated when we do that seeing step in the actual world, and then those translate into the counterfactual world. And we have this dashed arrow from fuels buildup at time 1 to treatment, because we're intervening on treatment in the counterfactual world to change it. And so that's an overwhelming intervention that gets rid of that backdoor pathway. Next slide, please. So one of the important things about using the Bayesian network is we can consider these backdoor pathways when we're intervening, when we're doing the intervention, as well as the seeing step with the counterfactual analysis. And so let's say we have a simple network here. We have fuels buildup at T1, that's time 1, fuels buildup at time 2, and then we have a treatment cause that's affecting the buildup at time 2, as well as the buildup at time 1. Next slide, please. And so oftentimes when we're using simulation models to build these Bayesian networks, we have information about on-the-ground conditions that we're using to optimize, for example, our treatment strategies. And so this creates a backdoor pathway between the buildup at time 1 and the treatment. And if we don't include that backdoor pathway, then we will be calculating our probabilities wrong. And so these 2 networks on either side are the same networks, but one includes the backdoor pathway and one doesn't. And when we condition on treatment, yes, with the backdoor pathway, the probabilities change for the buildup at time 1, which in turn also influences buildup at time 2. So we're getting a causal as well as an acausal pathway within the backdoor pathway. And the Bayesian networks allow us to consider this and calculate this, so we're not calculating our probabilities wrong. In this case, we'll be off by about 10% with our probabilities if we don't include the backdoor pathway in its influence. Next slide, please. So let's use some of the hypothetical examples we've been looking at and do a scenario analysis. Let's say an area did not receive fuels treatments and a wildfire of high severity occurred in this area. And we want to know, would the high severity fire have occurred if this area received a fuels treatment? Next slide. So here's our counterfactual analysis model. On the left, we have our actual world variables, the treatment variable going into the fuels buildup at time 2, going into our fire size threshold exceedance with true or false states. We have our background variables of fire exclusion and buildup at time 1 at the top. And then we have our counterfactual world mirroring the actual world with the stars next to the node names. And so we put the information that we have about what actually happened. There was no fuels treatment. So on the treatment node, we select no, 100%. We saw a fire size exceedance of a threshold that was considered severe, so we put true there for attributing that event. And then that updates our probabilities of the buildup at time 2 and the buildup at time 1, which then goes into the counterfactual world. And we say, well, what if we intervene to change it and say we wanted to do this treatment and see what the implications are? So we put in yes, and we see that a severe fire has a 67% chance of not occurring if there was a treatment done based on the information in this model. Next slide. So one of the really powerful things about doing these counterfactual analyses is we have the capabilities of calculating causal statistics that are very definitive, very precise, and very useful. And these are the probability of necessary causation, sufficient causation, and necessary and sufficient causation. And so the probability of necessary causation lets us know the probability that if A is a necessary cause for B, that means you will never have B if you don't have A. So we can calculate, well, is A necessary cause for B? And this is done by putting in the counterfactual world the probability the effect would not have occurred in the absence of the cause, and in the real world, putting in the information that the effect and cause did occur. So with our previous example network, we calculate a PN, or probability of necessary causation, of 0.8. Next slide, please. So if A is sufficient for B, then if you have A, you will always have B. However, the effect may occur sometimes without the cause. And so we calculate this in the counterfactual world as the probability the effect would have occurred in the presence of the cause. And in the real world, the effect and cause did not occur. And so in our case, our probability of sufficient causation is 0.67. Next slide. And finally, the most powerful one is the probability of necessary and sufficient causation. And so if we have a necessary and sufficient causal relationship, that means that the cause and effect are very, very tightly coupled. The effect will only occur when the cause occurs, and the effect won't occur when the cause doesn't occur. And we calculate this through an interventional analysis. So we intervene on our effect variable, in this case, treatment, and we put in yes, and we examine the probability that the fire size exceeding threshold does not occur, which is 0.68. And then we subtract that from intervening on treatment, no treatment, and examining the probability that the fire size exceeding threshold doesn't occur, which is 0.24. And so therefore our PNS is 0.44, which as we expect is lower than our PS and PN. Next slide, please. So we've been exploring these concepts and ideas and figuring out them, and preliminary work has been suggesting that there's possible utility and a lot of power in using causal counterfactual theory and modeling, especially for looking at retrospective analysis, retrodictive analysis, looking at performance of past mitigation investments, comparing the performance with and without, for example, as well as prospectively assessing future returns on investment with causal counterfactual theory and simulation modeling. However, there's thorny conceptual modeling details we need to work out, especially establishing the structures and things for the causal counterfactual analysis. And that's all we have. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And we have, I realized I forgot to give you the 5-minute warning. So we have about 2 minutes for questions. I'll just say that if your brain hurts a little bit, you're not alone. I've been talking with Mace and John about this for well over 6 months, and it's still hard to grasp sometimes. Just to clarify, one of the reasons that you need to do that backdoor calculus in order to get at causality of fuel treatments is because whenever you design a treatment strategy or optimize it, it's being influenced by the current state of the landscape, including treatment suitability, including areas of high hazard. So there's this necessary connection between current conditions, how you design your treatment, and then the effect that the treatment has on future conditions. With our last minute left, John, do you have any kind of examples that real world examples of kind of causal inference that would help us kind of ground this in the real world?
You mean as far as published examples of this?
Yeah.
I haven't done a full systematic review or anything, but there's not much out there right now. And the only thing I've actually seen has been a medicine example, looking at, if someone took the medicine, what would happen if they didn't take the medicine, for example, on their diagnosis.
Okay, well, thanks, John. And with that, we'll segue over to our third presenter. We have Jeff Falke. He is a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey based out of Alaska. He's with the Alaskan Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Service. And Jeff, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Everybody hear me okay? Assuming so.
Yep.
All right, great. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak in this session this afternoon. And so my talk this afternoon is going to focus on how we have and are using Bayesian networks to address some questions around the effects of wildfire on salmonid fishes and their habitats. And by salmonids for the non-fish folks out there, is a general term for Pacific salmon, trout, and char species. And so I'll focus today on two projects, the first of which was during my postdoc at Oregon State University, where we focused on the Wenatchee River Basin in Washington. And this work was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and thanks to my co-authors who are listed here. And then the second study is a current project here at UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, working in interior Alaska on boreal streams and fire. And this is funded by the United States Department of Defense and their Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. So to just set the stage a bit for both projects, talk about some background on fire and fish. There remains sort of this overarching paradigm that fire is a bad thing for fish. This is evidenced by this old poster where Smokey the Bear, here he is again, is telling us that forest fires catch fish too. But we know that wildfire is a natural and it's an important disturbance process, especially in Western North America. And fish have persisted and become adapted to these conditions in fire-prone landscapes for millennia. But these landscapes and riverscapes are changing from climate and land use change. And ultimately, the effects of fire on fish and their habitats really depend on the environmental context. And we're looking at a couple of quite different environmental contexts between the two studies, one in the Cascades of Washington and the other in interior Alaska. So what do we know sort of about the effects of fire on aquatic ecosystems? Well, it's a small but expanding body of literature. Mainly fire affects stream habitats as a result of altered watershed processes such as erosion and runoff, which are carried through to stream habitats, and it result in higher stream flows, increased input of wood, warmer stream temperatures from opening up the riparian canopy, and such. But with no sort of disrespect to Smokey, but immediate mortality of fish following fire is quite rare. Instead, it's these indirect effects of fire that have that are most important, we think. Here is just a cartoon sort of fire influenced stream food web. But what the main effects of fire, at least what we're observing, are these bottom-up effects from changing primary production in streams, from opening up that riparian canopy and the kind of pulses of nutrients that flow into streams following fires. And we know that climate drives all of this, these higher level processes like fire and vegetation dynamics. And so, although this context can vary from one system to the other, it's important. And regardless of sort of these differences in context, our questions for both studies are quite similar. And we're interested in fish species vulnerability to fire. And this is just a figure from a paper by Jason Dunham and others that shows that we expect that fish species vulnerability to fire exists along these axes of habitat size, connectivity, and habitat degradation. So we expect that fire vulnerability is going to be highest in small and isolated habitats that are easily degraded. But we also need to incorporate information on differences in species life histories. So for example, species that have more specific habitat needs may be more vulnerable to fire as well. So that's sort of the context that we're approaching this work with. And so our sort of overarching goals for both projects were to develop tools that can help assess the impact of fire on salmonids in both Washington and Alaska. And generally, we've taken a spatially explicit approach to assess the overlap between the predictions of the likelihood and severity of fire and the distribution of critical fish habitats. And so specifically for this first study, we started by mapping fish habitat quality using GIS, linking environmental model results in area to evaluate the areas that are most susceptible to fire, and then to assess the population vulnerability under a set of fire management and climate scenarios using a Bayesian network. So this first study was in the Wenatchee River Basin in Washington. It's about 3,400 square kilometer study basin. It's in a dry to mesic forest type, and the flow regimes there are snowmelt driven primarily. It also supports ESA listed populations of bull trout, Chinook salmon, and steelhead. And there's been widespread fires across this basin over the past several decades as a result of fire suppression and timber harvest, overgrazing, and climate change. And some of these fires have come quite close to the populated areas in the basin. So we use this Bayesian network approach as our analytical approach. And here's a list of some of these advantages of the Bayesian network approach. And I think most of us are familiar with these, but for these particular projects that I'm talking about, we were interested in the ability to, for the Bayesian network to provide a formal decision support to evaluate relative differences among management decisions. And also we were taking advantage of the outcomes that are expressed as probabilities, so we can directly predict these relative differences in outcomes. So we use the program Netica for this analysis. And I don't have time to review today, but Bayesian networks have been used in other salmonid vulnerability analyses for about the past 20 years. So there's a pretty rich history of it. And we recently published a paper. This is outside of the fire world, but it was on the vulnerability of juvenile salmon to predatory invasive northern pike in South Central Alaska. So that's a recent salmonid Bayesian network publication. So in our model, our nodes were in the network were physical factors that contribute to the habitat suitability for two species of interest. They were bull trout and Chinook salmon. And the functional relationships that we used were derived from a mix of statistical models and expert opinion. For example, here's a relationship between the probability of bull trout occurrence and maximum daily water temperature. So they're quite sensitive to high temperatures. And so for bull trout, we assessed their population vulnerability at two scales, the reach scale of streams and this patch scale, which was sort of contiguous habitat. And then for Chinook salmon, we were more interested in a life stage specific approach, where we looked at factors that are influencing their survival in freshwater at the egg fry stage, the juvenile overwinter stage, and the spawning adult stage. And so we calculated these variables continuously across the basin using a combination of GIS and geospatial models. And I don't have time to talk about all the methods that went into that, but two of them that I think are quite interesting here are the fire model that's linked to stream temperature. And so we used this Flam map and Wind Ninja model to look at spatially explicit predictions of fire likelihood and severity, which is a function of the current forest structure, fuel loads, wind direction, and topography. You can kind of see over here on the fire likelihood how it's more likely at these ridge tops than in valley bottoms. And this allowed us to look at the effects of fire across the entire basin. And so we developed a process to link the fire model output to stream temperature using remotely sensed land surface temperature from NASA's MODIS platform and predicting stream temperature based on that. And so we were also able to look at how land surface temperature changed pre to post fire and then translate that into stream temperature and some metrics that are important for fish. So I'll skip sort of straight to the results here from that work. And so this is an example of the Bayesian network model output for bull trout population vulnerability to fire. So here the red areas are more vulnerable and the green areas are less. And the terminal node of this network represented this composite of fire effects, fish habitat quality, and connections among habitats. So just as an example here, we can see here that this particular area was, even though it was upstream of a barrier to movement, was classified as low vulnerability, similar to this area over here. But when we also map out the uncertainty around those predictions, which is really interesting, we see that we're much more certain about the vulnerability classification over here relative to this place over here. And so these two pieces of information are really important to know when assessing where to direct management resources. And so that was a really nice quality of the network approach. A couple of other kind of pertinent results here. Here we're looking at the interaction between fire and climate change. And so one of our metrics of vulnerability for bull trout was the amount of contiguous habitat patches relative to fire size. And so what we found is that currently the mean patch size was larger than the average fire size. Okay, but if we take a conservative sort of increased fire size 25% in the future, what we find is that all of these patches of available habitat are smaller than the average fire size, which means there's an increased risk of burning an entire patch with one fire. So again, this is important information for conservation planning. As far as the Chinook salmon, here, these are the overall habitat trends. And so we looked at this as a life stage approach, and we found using the Bayesian network that the effects of fire are predicted to be differential depending on the life stage. And so we see a slight decrease in habitat quality for eggs pre to post fire, and for adult spawning pre to post fire, but for juvenile habitat actually increased post fire. And this is something that we're also finding here in Alaska. So moving on to just a little broad brush strokes description of the work that we're doing right now in Alaska. Again, similar questions, but a slightly different approach and across a broader scale than in Washington. And so here's a map of fire perimeters in Alaska. We can see fire is broadly distributed across the interior of Alaska, and it closely matches the boreal ecosystem. In fact, it's really the primary disturbance agent in these systems. Climate change is amplifying wildfire in Alaska. We're seeing higher temperatures, especially at night, that are drying ground level vegetation. In fact, 9 of the 10 warmest summers have occurred since 1990. We're seeing a shorter snow season, a longer fire season, and an increase in the frequency and size of fires. This is this time series shows the number of acres burned per year, and these large fire years that are 1 million acres or more are increasing, even though the last couple of years have been relatively small. So our study area in Alaska is right here in interior Alaska. This is where we're at. 4 large river basins that are tributaries to the Tanana and Yukon River basins. It's about 20,000 square kilometers, and about a quarter of this study area has burned in the last 30 years. And actually the area burned in this study area is the same size as the entire Wenatchee River Basin that we looked at in the previous study. But from a fisheries perspective, these are important places. The Salcha and the Chena River here are the 2 largest producers of Chinook salmon in the entire Yukon River Basin, including Canada. And Chinook and the Yukon have declined in recent years, and climate change impacts on freshwater production have been implicated in that decline. But kind of in contrast to the Wenatchee work that was entirely model-based, field work is a large component of this work that we're doing in Alaska. And part of that is simply because we don't know that much about fish species and habitat relationships, regardless of fire and climate change. But here's a conceptual model of showing how all the project components link together. But the main thing to take away here is we designed this so that the field observations are informing our environmental models and vice versa, which then feed into these management tools and decision-making piece. So I'll move along here. some of the patterns that we're observing in the field strongly indicate that sites that have recently burned are more productive than unburned sites. They have higher biomass and diversity of both fish and invertebrates. And so our next step here is to quantify the strength of relationships among these patterns that we're observing using food web analysis. But this is really key information. And so it helps us to inform how to maintain this resiliency in the face of changing fire and climate regimes. Now, as far as the modeling piece, we've developed a suite of environmental models to model fire and aquatic ecosystem dynamics. And it's similar to the previous work that I talked about, but these models are explicitly linked together versus kind of simply layering model output in a GIS. And so, for example, climate-driven changes in vegetation dynamics affect patterns of fire on the landscape, which result in changes in stream flow and water temperature regimes, which then in turn affect the growth potential of juvenile salmon. And so I wish I had time to provide more details on these models because they're really interesting. My collaborators shown here have done a lot of hard work on these so far, and they're complete, and the model output has been generated. And so now we're at the stage of sort of what does it all mean for the resiliency of fish populations to fire? And so none of these environmental models explicitly incorporate fish. And so the step that we're working at now is to link those to the fish part. We're working on 4 applications that apply these model outputs to fish. And then we're going to synthesize these results using that Bayesian network approach. And so some kind of key questions from a management perspective that we're after here. But, you know, this being approach, I think, should be quite useful in the context of management decision-making in Alaska. And I'll finish up here by showing an example. So fire management in Alaska differs quite a bit from the lower 48 in that the state is divided up into these 4 broad management options, which are selected by the land management agency that owns the land. And so, for example, you know, the BLM can set the fire management option for their land specifically. And so these options reflect the objectives and mission of those various agencies. And so they range from natural fire regime all the way to full suppression. But as you can see on this map, about 65% of the state is in this natural let it burn fire option. And so some of the things that we can do, I'm just going to zoom in here, on a area right here around Fairbanks. We can ask questions like, what would happen if you change this parcel of land from limited protection to full protection? In other words, you know, what would the effects be on fish growth and the distribution of habitats in those areas from changing those fire management options? And so that's the sort of thing that we're moving towards with this network approach. And I think it would be great for this because it'll allow us to carry that uncertainty that we have from all the environmental models through to the decision-making process. And also be able to directly incorporate knowledge from managers and other stakeholders right into the analysis. And then we'll end up with these maps of resiliency and vulnerability and uncertainty across our study area, similar to what we did with the work in Washington. And this really fits right into the structured decision-making process that we're using to engage with fish and fire managers. And so the end goal here is going to be a set of web-based tools for mapping and data exploration of fire and climate impacts on aquatic ecosystems. And our team has already developed this system for terrestrial ecosystems and has the capacity to build those out for these aquatic systems. All right, so we're looking forward to continuing this fish and fire work over the next several years, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you this afternoon. And I'd welcome any questions or feedback either now or after the session today. And here's my contact information. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I should note I have that shirt. A buddy gave it to me when he came home from Alaska.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
We got about a minute and a half. So I wanted to ask one question. I really kind of liked your example of changing management strategies and management regimes and how you can kind of, you know, forecast the counterfactual of how that would affect it. Are you gaming out any scenarios where, for example, expanded energy development is going to be the catalyst, or like what are the catalysts for the change in the management strategy that would result in the need to model changed implications for fish?
Yeah, I think that some of it is going to be, increased population size and density of housing and that sort of, especially in our area here around Fairbanks, where our military bases are increasing and we're seeing a large influx in new folks and housing developments and that sort of thing. So expanding out that full suppression, it seems to be pretty likely. But, as far as the actual management scenarios, we're working directly with our management community to develop those scenarios. And so it's kind of going to depend on what they feel like is going to be the biggest issues to look at going forward. And we'll start with some examples that we think are, but I expect some surprises coming in once we get in the room with those folks.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And just to put a plug, we're going to go back to the uncertainty analysis question that Wayne Landis had posed. I was really intrigued by that one slide that showed the vulnerability, but then the uncertainty and how the two hotspots didn't necessarily co-align. So,
yeah, I found that the uncertainty estimates are almost as interesting or important as the actual vulnerability estimates.
Well, we will hit that in the discussion later today. So
cool.
Our last presenter of the day is Kate Parkins. She is from the University of Melbourne. She is an ecologist and a fire risk analyst. And Kate, thanks very much. Take it away.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. So yes, I'm Kate and I'm coming to you today from the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. And my talk today is Why Did the Fire Cross the Road? Modelling roadside fire management strategies to reduce risk. And I'd like to begin my talk by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands in which I'm coming to you from today, the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung and Wurundjeri Woi people. I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators. This was a joint project between Flare Wildfire Research at the University of Melbourne and the Forest Fire Management, part of the government department. So roads, we use them all the time, but chances are you probably haven't ever paid too much attention to the vegetation that runs alongside the road. If you have noticed it, it's probably because it's ended up in your way. Perhaps a tree or a branch has fallen onto the road, requiring you to navigate around it. Roadside vegetation is primarily managed from a road safety perspective. However, here in Australia, in the wake of several catastrophic bushfire seasons, roadside vegetation is starting to be considered from a fire management perspective. Roadside vegetation has been identified by local communities, fire management authorities, and emergency services as an area of concern, particularly on days of high fire danger. The primary concerns relate to safe access and egress on these high fire danger days, as roads are critical for facilitating safe evacuations from high danger areas and also access into the fire ground. Roads are also used commonly as fuel breaks, providing seemingly low risk areas for fuel breaks and for containment activities. However, due to long-term land clearing, roadside vegetation patches are also often of very high environmental or ecological significance. They sometimes represent remnant vegetation in an otherwise cleared landscape. So inappropriate fire regimes in these areas may result in significant ecological change. Therefore, managing roadside vegetation for environmental conservation, fire prevention, and road safety presents a complex and challenging task for land managers. We also know that on days of high fire danger, roads are some of the riskiest places to be. Sadly, every fire season we see headlines like these, where fires have resulted in injury or death on roads, primarily as people try to flee the fire front with strong winds, high temperatures, and flames, causing trees to fall along roadsides. It's therefore extremely important that we start to consider roadside vegetation from a fire management perspective, so that it does not impinge on the essential functions that roads need to play on days of high fire danger. So the aim of this project was to quantify the risks that are associated with roadside vegetation and fire, and test a series of fuel management scenarios which might help to reduce those risks. In particular, we wanted to know, what is it about the roadside vegetation that contributes to high risk? And using this information, can we therefore identify where the highest risk roads are? And if we can, how can management help to mitigate some of these risks? So ultimately, what we wanted to know is, what is the likelihood of a particular road becoming blocked by a fallen tree or branch? So this is obviously a perfect problem for Bayesian network modeling. So we started by developing an influence diagram. Next, we began to populate the nodes that we could with any available or existing data. For the nodes that lacked available data, we held expert elicitation workshops to fill these data gaps. And then we tested a series of different management scenarios to see how that might change risk. And finally, we spatialized our Bayesian network so that this would help us prioritize the location of future management. Our study area was in southeastern Australia, so in a region called the Barwon Southwest region. So it's about an hour and a half to the west of Melbourne. You can see from the map here that this area is predominantly cleared agricultural land. However, it is characterised by a lot of roadside vegetation in an otherwise cleared landscape. And we also have some patches in the southeast that are comprised of this sort of continuous forest down here. So first of all, we held a workshop with project committee and stakeholders, and we came up with an influence diagram to model the variables that we thought would be likely contributing to a road becoming blocked. We developed our Bayesian network model using Netica, and what started out as a very simple, straightforward BayesNet about what contributes to the risk of a road becoming blocked ended up looking a little bit like this. So unfortunately, today I don't have time to step you through all of these nodes. So in the interest of time, we'll just step through a couple of the sections and I'll talk you through how we populated the conditional probability tables. Essentially, this whole left side of the model refers to whether or not the likelihood of a road becoming blocked, and the right side of the model looks at if a road becomes blocked, what is the likelihood of somebody encountering that blockage? So this blue part of our model explores the type of weather that is most conducive to tree fall. To populate our weather nodes, we collected and analysed 15 years of data from 2006 to 2019, and this data was provided by our Victorian State Emergency Service. So every time the State Emergency Service is called out to remove a branch or a tree from a road, they log it into a database. So therefore, we end up with the time, the date, and the location of each incident. We ended up with over 180,000 records across 15 years. These data were then combined with the closest local weather stations, and we extracted the conditions on the day where the SES was notified of a fallen tree. We were able to extract temperature, wind speed, predominant wind direction, drought factor, and relative humidity, which populated our weather nodes. We also linked this to our forest fire danger index, which is our fire danger rating system, and the presence of fire in the landscape, as we expected this to increase the likelihood of things falling. Next, we have this part of the model which we're calling vegetation exposure, which is essentially what makes a patch of roadside vegetation more vulnerable to falling. We didn't have much empirical data to populate these nodes, so these gaps were filled using an expert elicitation approach. We held workshops with a diverse range of tree experts, arborists, and land and fire managers. Participants determined that larger blocks that were oriented away from the prevailing wind were predicted to be less exposed and therefore of lower risk compared to thinner strips that were oriented perpendicular to the prevailing wind. We then considered characteristics of individual trees that make them more likely to fall over. And again, these nodes were populated primarily using an expert elicitation approach, where our tree experts and land managers defined the characteristics of trees that make them more susceptible to falling, things like age, whether there's a high proportion of dead material. And then we had them estimate the likelihood and the rate of which trees and branches might fall under a range of different conditions. Then we validated many of these individual tree nodes by undertaking a series of tree assessments using Google Earth. We took a virtual drive, thanks to COVID restrictions, around our study region, and we used Google Street View to visually assess over 2,000 trees across 350 roadsides within our study region. So this was used as a bit of a cross-validation for these nodes. So all of this comes together in this one little red node down here, which is our road blocked node. So given all of these factors, what is the probability that a road ends up blocked? We then took it one step further, and this was to look at overall risk. So our overall risk node is essentially a combination of the probability that a tree or branch has fallen, the probability that that tree will then block the road, and the probability that a vehicle will encounter that blockage. So the final part of the Bayes net, which is the pink section on the far right, this considers traffic volumes, travel speeds, and stopping distances to estimate the probability of impacting a blocked road. Much of this data was derived from previous studies by Ellison in 2005, but we also populated some of these nodes with local traffic and road data where possible. So ultimately, what the Bayes net does is it gives us the probability of a road being blocked, and if present, what is the risk to a vehicle and therefore people. So given all of this, what did we find? We used the sensitivity to findings function in Netica, which examines the extent to which change in one variable affects a variable of interest. So for us, the variable of interest was our overall risk. The sensitivity to finding analysis demonstrates that overall risk is predominantly a function of whether the road is blocked or not. So if the road is blocked, the overall risk of getting stuck is much higher, which makes logical sense. The other factors contributing to higher risk were the number of trees that had fallen. However, we found that road blocked was more than twice as important as the number down, meaning that anything falling on roadsides contributes to higher risk, regardless of the number of things that fell. Risk was also influenced by the amount of potential overlap or overhang, essentially referring to if there is a very tall tree that ends up falling on the road, the amount of overlap will contribute to whether the road is properly blocked or not. So given all of this, the next step was to determine if and how management might mitigate some of these risks. So without going into too much detail here, we tested 19 different fuel management scenarios across both grassed and forested roadsides. And we did this by modifying fuel loads in Phoenix Rapid Fire, which is a fire behavior simulator. The scenarios were broadly set to act as proxies for different types of management. For example, prescribed burning down to 0 tonnes per hectare, slightly higher tonnes per hectare with grazing, slashing and mulching, a range of different combinations of these. And these were compared to a do nothing approach or no treatment. What we found was the best management scenario for reducing risk to a range of metrics like annual area burnt and house loss was to undertake prescribed burning of grass fuels at a regional scale. This was closely followed by heavy grazing or slashing of grassed fuels at a regional scale. And our third best option was to burn grassed fuels at roadsides and slash or heavily graze grass fuels more broadly across the region. We found that across all scenarios, the no management or do nothing approach was by far the worst performing of the scenarios, resulting in higher annual area burns and much greater impacts to infrastructure and other assets of interest. So this indicates that any management along roadsides is likely to reduce the future impact of fires. So given that fire management resources are universally scarce, we wanted to find a way to identify where the highest risk roads currently are in the landscape so that management expenditure can be prioritised in these locations. We ran many iterations of our BaseNet and spatialised the outputs. So this map shows the relative likelihood of a car encountering a blocked road under no treatment. The green dots on the map represent our lower overall risk, and the red dots refer to a higher risk. So using these outputs, managers in the region can start to identify the parts of the road network that carry the highest risk. We then tested our best performing management scenarios to see where management might be able to reduce this risk. So this map shows a residual risk, that is, how much risk remains after you've undertaken management. The blue dots indicate areas where risk has been reduced, and red segments indicate areas where management has not had a meaningful reduction in risk. So these results help land and fire managers identify the parts of the road network that carry the highest risk and where they can prioritise management to yield the greatest reduction in risk. So, in conclusion, it's important to consider roadside vegetation from a fire management perspective. To reduce the likelihood of a road becoming blocked by falling vegetation and being encountered by a vehicle, there are several things that we can do. We can reduce the amount of overhang. We can remove any high risk vegetation on a regular basis. So any trees that are leaning towards the road or have a high proportion of dead material. At a slightly larger scale, any new plantings should consider the size, shape, and orientation of their future plantings along roadsides. We should also ensure that regular fuel management is undertaken at roadsides and that this is undertaken more broadly across the landscape in combination. And we found that prescribed burning, grazing, and slashing will result in the greatest reduction in risk. So effective risk mitigation along roadsides is just one piece of the puzzle that helps protect people and reduce fire spread on days of high fire danger. And this will become more important as the climate changes and we see more frequent and more severe fires. So hopefully this research will contribute to making our roads safer on days of high fire danger. Thanks very much.
Hey, thanks, Kate. Appreciate it. A couple of questions that came to my mind. The first is, this was framed rather in many respects around the question of citizen and public safety for egress and evacuation. I wonder if you have thought at all about using similar types of modeling approach to get at the role of roads in suppression operations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really big part of the picture because they are used very commonly for suppression, and we don't have a lot of choice about where the roads are in the landscape, and particularly in regional areas, there's often only fairly small, not terribly well maintained roads. So that was definitely part of our thinking. It's sort of the next part of the model, I think, is to look at the type of roads, the things like turning angles, whether trucks, dozers, those kind of things can access those roads and turn around if it becomes blocked. Yeah, so I think it is definitely a really important part, probably the next phase of the project, to bring in that sort of suppression response and how roads might hinder or help that.
Cool. I think it's about 20 after the hour, 1 minute shy. So maybe this would be a good chance just to segue into the broader group discussion. So if the panelists wouldn't mind, please kind of turning your cameras on and getting ready to answer or pose some questions to other participants. Maybe we'll start with you, Kate. And this is a question from Wayne Landis. My world has more nodes. How many before the analysis is a problem? And he may have been referring specifically to some of the thorny challenges of that causal backdoor pathway calculus that John was talking about. But you showed a fairly extensive network that you had to populate through a combination of data analysis and expert judgment elicitation. I'm wondering if you could just comment on the amount of time and effort that goes into not only designing, from influence diagram all the way to figuring out how you populate, just how much work goes into building a model like that and testing and validating it.
Yeah, sure. I think it's one of the most interesting parts of using Bayesian networks is sort of how big is too big. And so for us, this was a really big project. We didn't anticipate that it would be quite as big as it was. It seemed like a relatively easy question to address, but when we actually sat down and started building even a conceptual framework to start teasing this apart, we sort of found ourselves adding nodes and more nodes and more nodes, and then suddenly we ended up with this just completely unwieldy BayesNet. And I think some of the risks with that is that you lose some of your sensitivity in it, and that's definitely something that we found. So the net that we ended up with that in itself is a refined BayesNet, because we found that by putting in different management options, we weren't actually seeing a reduction in risk that we expected. So we sort of then had to go back and go, okay, where are highly correlated nodes? What can we take out of the model to make sure that we are capturing the sensitivity that we require? So it did take us a very long time. It was lots and lots of workshops with stakeholders. And the project, as I said, is a pilot study. And the aim is to roll it out more broadly, but that is definitely still a work in progress. So lots still to do.
Kate, I got a question for you, just in terms of after the Black Summer, any like huge policy changes in how the Australian government just sort of views wildfires or deals with where your country just catastrophically burned, like anything really substantive in terms of government policy changes to maybe help protect the bush or something?
Yeah, big question. We've obviously had some really major bushfire seasons here. Thankfully, it's quite wet at the moment, so hopefully this season will be not as bad. It's a very slow moving ball, I guess, with fire management here. So a lot of the recommendations for this work that we've been doing came about from the Black Saturday bushfires, which were held in 2009. So the Royal Commission into that fire, which is many years ago now, some of the recommendations were to undertake a strategic assessment of roadsides. And, it's a very tough thing in that there's not a lot of resources. It's a difficult area, but a really important area. So it's taken us up until now to be able to actually start investigating some of this. So I would say there's been some policy changes, but nothing, I guess, major that influences at least this work in particular, just that it's obviously important. And yeah, there's thankfully some interest in it now, which is really good.
There was one go back to specifically to your presentation, Kate, just your final risk node, was it defined as expected number of accidents or loss of life, or what was the final risk metric defined as?
Sure, yeah, this one always, I always get lots of questions about this. I probably haven't defined it particularly well. So it's essentially the probability that a road is blocked, and so it comes from the probability that something has fallen in combination with the fact that the road ends up blocked, and then it brings in your traffic information. So assuming there is a car traveling on that road, what is the risk of impact, I guess. So the risk that somebody traveling on a blocked road encounters that blockage. So it's essentially a risk, an overall risk of an accident, I guess, would be the best way to look at it.
Cool. I have a go back to that uncertainty analysis, but before I do that, any other panelists have any questions for each other, or any things that kind of resonated with you along the way?
Yeah, I have a question for Kate and Jeff. I really like your maps you guys showed. I'm just wondering how each of you interface Netica with GIS. Was there a specific kind of software you used, or how was that done?
Jeff, do you want to go first?
Yeah, yeah, we output the data from GIS into a CSV and pull it into Netica. That way there's not a formal kind of link between the two programs. Though I was just on Norisis's website. I hadn't been on there for a while in preparation for this talk, and it looks like they have some they're starting to build some of that functionality into Netica, at least to be able to interface with raster data, which is not really the world that we work in kind of streams and networks. We're more in the vector polygon world. And so, I'm glad it's going in that direction. I think it would be really useful to be able to do that, especially if you can, from being able to manipulate the network and seeing the results, right? And so that's kind of some of the stuff that we're trying to work towards with this management tools and decision support tools. But it's outside of my expertise for sure, to be able to build out something like that. But I think it's what we're trying to get at, and it would be great to be able to actually have the BN driving that. But we'll see kind of where we can get with it.
Yep. So similar in a way, we have an integration between GIS. QGIS Pro using raster files and linking that to our Netica. So I probably am not the best person to talk about this. One of my collaborators, Brett Zeroulis, is our amazing computer guy. So he makes me beautiful graphs. But there is, I believe, an integration between our Netica and QGIS, but involves lots of coding.
There's a new question. In the Hoover chat. And it's directed at you, Kate, but I think, Mace, it would also be interesting to get your insight here, because the question is, how do you deal with the communication issues around, for example, framing something as in terms of risk as a metric versus explicitly discussing loss of life, and whether that becomes sensitive or politically contentious. Obviously, Kate, in this case, we're talking about citizens and evacuation and egress, but Mace, in your world of toxicology, there's all sorts of human life and safety issues as well. So maybe you both could address some of the communication and linguistic issues.
Yeah, sure. It's obviously the majority of the work that I do is in fire risk frameworks, and it's definitely something that we are very, very conscious of. The terminology around that it's very important to get that right. So for us, it's very much about saying these are statistical models. So it's a statistical probability of life loss or statistical probability of house loss, and making sure that that is really clear, not saying this is the number of people that will be affected. It's a statistical probability. I think using the term risk, it's something that we use quite a lot here in Australia. So being able to look at what your level of risk is, and it is a bit of a murky term, I guess, but being able to particularly demonstrate this is your current risk, and by doing this part of management, this is how your risk changes. So I guess looking at the range of change that you can achieve in your overall risk is something that we use quite a lot.
So, for example, at US EPA, in order to create a new regulation that's going to cost, some sort of monetary cost to society or the regulated industry, there is a cost benefit analysis. And so one of the sort of the metrics that is used. It's the same as Kate said, it's a statistical one, is like cancer deaths avoided. So I don't know what the, the direct, like a more direct effect of like, inhalation, exposure, stuff like that from to say fire responders and things like that. But that's how we've cast it, as deaths avoided, not people that are going to die. But that's been palatable for the politicians, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me it has a lot of commonalities with issues, for example, around smoke exposure and community risk in those aspects. Okay, let's go back to the question that Wayne started us off with, which is addressing issues of uncertainty analysis and sensitivity analysis. As an admitted novice in this world, I admit I kind of have some questions just around even, we just talked about definitions of risk. There's also different characterizations and frameworks for looking at uncertainty, right? In many frameworks, it's much more than probabilistic. There's, characterizing the source of uncertainty, characterizing its nature, which can be anywhere from able to be quantified probabilistically all the way to deep levels of ignorance. There's the level. People talk about linguistic uncertainty and ambiguity, which is something that's hard to kind of capture probabilistically. So I'm just kind of obviously rambling. I'm just curious to, maybe we can ground this in the map you showed, Jeff, which is, you showed a map that showed uncertainty. What does that map mean, and how is that uncertainty defined and quantified? What do we learn from it?
Yeah, so, and now I have to think back to what I did with that a few years back. But that uncertainty is in the state classification as to low, moderate, or high vulnerability. And so it was kind of directly exported out of Netica as part of the estimates that were associated with that. But it turned out to make a lot of sense when we actually mapped it out like that. Whereas, if we hadn't have done that, I don't know that we would have been able to get as much out of it. And I found that, just showing those maps to folks and managers in particular, it seems to make a lot of sense. And especially helps to soften, I guess, just the complexity of the models themselves, to be able to show that, hey, look, this is the uncertainty that we're dealing with, as well as kind of what the sources of it are. And that all seems to make a lot of sense to folks. So it's been useful for us.
So can you, for example, kind of deconstruct that color-coded map into what are the sources of uncertainty that are making this? Is it from your climate modeling? Is it from your fire modeling? Like, can you backtrack that to show
right?
Where it's coming from?
Yeah. And so that vulnerability in that estimate, that sort of terminal node was a function of, the effects of fire, the quality of fish habitat, and then the connections among those habitats. And so it was just like that vulnerability little cartoon diagram that I showed to begin with. And I think that the main uncertainty was definitely coming from the fire modeling itself. The connectivity piece was pretty cut and dry. We have a good knowledge of where barriers exist. In fact, there's maps of those that are readily available. And the habitat, estimates that we made, most of those were based on pretty robust models that have been tested fairly well. So there wasn't, too much uncertainty around those estimates, but the fire model, I think, was the biggest source of it for that particular analysis.
Okay, and kind of to the second part of Wayne's question, he asked about the role of sensitivity analysis. Wayne, I see you've come on screen. If you would like to not have me bastardize your questions, please feel free.
No, my comment to the uncertainty one you just talked about is that I think we underestimate it for the most part. And for us, that's one of the most detailed things we do. Every node, you write how we got it, what the uncertainties are, where they're from, and so forth and so on. And then we play what if games. Let's say that we have a distribution. Let's add to the tails to represent the uncertainty we think we have and see if it makes a difference. So we play all kinds of games like that all the way through it. And I think some of you guys do as well. My other thing that makes me nervous are maps. Maps, people are so used to getting to where they want to go in their Google map, and almost always gets you there. I'm not sure our maps are as accurate when it comes to portraying the probability of events in its landscape. So we actually use very few regions in a map and ones that we have data for. So those are my issues, but I've been doing this now for a while. And I think you guys may have other issues that I can learn about, and maybe I shouldn't be so concerned, but to me, it's always the uncertainty analysis and the sensitivity. So we run multiple scenarios to try to map out what we think those are. And the communicating uncertainty to people is really difficult, and I completely agree with that, because most people think uncertainty is a feeling they have in the bottom of their stomach when they're about to do something they're not sure about. And for us, it means something completely different. So I find communicating uncertainty to be a huge challenge. So those are my comments, and I'd like to hear what you guys have to think. And then we go through this tomorrow afternoon too, don't we? Yep. Afternoon, my time. Yeah.
And one question to follow up on, Wayne, and then maybe we can open it up, is maybe the distinction between, for example, the figure that Kate showed, which I think was a sensitivity analysis that was just kind of like a programmable module in Netica that just shows which variable is more important, which is different than I think what you're describing, which is actually changing the nature of distributions and parameters.
Absolutely,
correct?
absolutely.
Okay.
So, and I do like the mutual information. I like that measure. So it's a good measure of sensitivity, but it's very sensitive as to where the node is in the model. Yeah. And John, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. It's in Mace too. So, yeah.
Any comments on Wayne's input?
John, how about jump on in, and you've got some expertise in this area.
Yeah, John and I do over a beer.
Yeah, the information theory provides very powerful ways of looking at the uncertainty and mutual information, as well as entropy for individual variables and things like that. And I think going back to Pearl's ladder, or at least our modified interpretation of it, I think when we start moving up into the decision modeling, that's when uncertainty analysis and hedging your bets with decisions and things becomes really important, and you have to start asking questions about value of information, willingness to pay for information. Can reducing this uncertainty actually change a decision? Is ultimately what you want to know before you invest in collecting the data itself. And I think that really puts it something concrete on top of that information theory kind of measures and things like that.
So, John, that's a great point. I just had a case about 4 weeks ago where I was really worried about, are we going to be able to do what this guy needs and stuff? And he goes, oh, no, if you can just do those 3 variables, that will help me so much. And he's a manager for a good part of the middle of California. I'm going, oh, we can do that. So that'll help him make the decision. He doesn't need to know perfect causality, but it's an endangered species, a delta smelt, which they're not even finding now. And so if I'm just giving him an insight into a management strategy for him, it seems like it's very valuable. And I teach the ladder causality now in my undergraduate risk assessment class. And they go, that's it? It's such a cute ladder. I said, well, it's very powerful too. Then I say, weights of evidence, forget about that. That's not necessary anymore. There's better ways of doing it. So, yeah.
This conversation that makes you scratch your head is exactly why it would have been nice to be over a cold beverage near a beach somewhere, but maybe next year. Kate, did you have anything to weigh in about the sensitivity analysis discussion?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I found quite interesting with, I was quite new to expert elicitation approach to derive some of the information, and that's one of the things that we were very cautious about, making sure that we're capturing individuals, I guess, their own uncertainty within their estimates. So we used like a modified Delphi protocol, which This is called the IDEA protocol. So where you investigate, discuss, estimate, and then aggregate. So we got our participants to give us their best guess. So giving them a situation and then saying, what is your best guess? And then what is your, to work out what the range of their values were. So what is the lowest feasible value that you could see for that particular event? And what is the highest value? So, and getting that to happen over and over again, and then coming back as a group and sharing everybody's best guess and lower and upper estimates, discussing that and encouraging people to go, oh, okay, so I see why you've done that. Then aggregating all of that together helps us to populate, I guess, some of that uncertainty through nodes where we are filling them through expert elicitation.
Yeah, I forget the author of the article, but it's something to the effect of use experts wisely. And it goes into all of the human biases that can come into elicitation. That's an interesting, if not fascinating, field in its own right. With that, we are at 100 minutes. And so thanks everyone for participating. Thank you to the presenters. Thanks, Wayne, for joining us. I look forward to hearing from you.
I've been here the whole time. I didn't want to butt in too much.
Oh, please. Yeah, and for Kate, Mace, Jeff, and John, tomorrow when we have the group discussion, please feel free to join. And we will be having the second session, 4 additional presenters, again, from North America as well as Australia tomorrow. So it should be a good session, and hope everyone has a good night and a productive conference day tomorrow. Thank you very much.
This is great.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for all of our speakers. This session will be available in Huba on our conference app within 2 weeks of the Congress ending. We hope you stick around for a couple of our great networking opportunities tonight from 6:30 to 7 Eastern time. We're hosting a networking session for first-time Congress attendees with a welcome and Q&A. And from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern time, we encourage you to visit our exhibitor booths to connect with our Congress sponsors and partners. To meet with our sponsors and browse the virtual booth content, click exhibitors in the navigation bar. As a reminder, we do have a passport contest. You can earn stamps by visiting exhibitor booths and liking, commenting, or participating in deals and offers. Attendees with the most stamps will be entered into a drawing to win a free Fire Congress registration for 2023. Thank you all again. Thank you to all of our speakers, and have a great night. I hope you had a great first day.
Thank you, Sam. Bye, everyone.